they would want for. Now, listen, I mentioned that I had received a very long and complex message to do with a subject that's coming up in just a moment, parental alienation. Before I bring that to air, I'm going to have to read it and look at it carefully. So while I'm doing that, you're going to enjoy this. Yes, on the morning mix, an actual piece of music. This is Donna Lewis. I love you always and forever.
Southeast Radio's morning mix. Southeast
Radio. Just coming up to 16 minutes now to 11. You're listening to Wednesday's morning mix for the next hour and a quarter, I hope. And it is Alan McGuire with you until 12 o'clock, sitting in for Alan Corcoran. I mentioned already that we will be focusing as part of this programme on parental alienation. It's a form of psychological abuse where one parent manipulates a child to reject the other. And right now, it isn't legally recognised in this country. Well, our reporter Lucinda Kelly has been speaking with Paul Anderson, an advocate for families affected by parental alienation, to hear why he believes urgent action is needed.
Parental alienation is being described as a silent crisis affecting families across Ireland, where one parent manipulates a child to reject the other. Advocates say it's a serious form of psychological abuse that remains unrecognised in Irish law. I spoke earlier with Paul Anderson, an advocate for alienated children, mothers, fathers and grandparents, to find out why he believes the government needs to take urgent action. Paul, for our listeners who might not be familiar with the term, what exactly is parental alienation and what does it look like in real life?
I just want to state I'm not an expert in parental alienation. I'm just an advocate. I've been advocating for alienated children, parents, grandparents for a number of years. I've just gathered together information over the years. So my definition and my explanations and that aren't the scientific answers or the legal ones, to let you know that. And I've never been alienated personally myself in my life. So the experiences of alienated parents who don't have a voice in Ireland because of the in-camera law and because basically the government's ignoring their voice, not even speaking to them, meeting with them as a group is a nonsense, especially when they've done a lot of work on parental alienation over the years. What I'll tell you, parental alienation is like a centers on a child's unjustified refusal to have a relationship with one parent caused by the other parent's behaviours. Now, what happens is there are opponents of parental alienation, and they would mix this up with parental estrangement, where there's addiction or abuse factors involved. But this would be a rejection by a child through manipulation and various other behaviours that are unjustified because that parent, whether a mother or father or grandparent, has never been abusive to that child, because parental alienation doesn't involve abuse except for by the person who's committing the emotional abuse. Examples of parental alienation are bad-mouthing the rejected parent, limiting contact and interfering with communication. That includes breaking court orders left, right and centre. There's a notable case in Ennis in the 2020s where a judge called out the case of parental alienation where a parent broke 24 court orders and wasn't penalised, eradicating any reminder of the parent, wiping them out, even changing their surname, which happens, creating a false narrative of abuse or neglect to the child, telling the child how bad that parent was in their life and what they'd done and abandoned them and so on, and forcing the child to choose sides. So there's some of the alienating behaviours. There's a whole list of them, which are used more or less so in parental alienation.
Okay, you've spoken to many parents then, I'd say, Paul, and grandparents affected. What kind of emotional and psychological impact does this have on both the children and the parents?
Well, on the parents, and this is all backed up by scientific knowledge because there's over 1,000 peer-reviewed cases internationally and growing on parental alienation. There hasn't been any major survey in Ireland, which is a factor of why the Irish government have let down the parents. Obviously, it's grieving A parent is grieving for a living child. The trauma of going through court, of lies, the alienating parent built up their case on a bed of lies and false allegations. For instance, in a lot of cases, there'll be a false allegation of domestic or child abuse, and the father or mother would have to leave the family house. Straight away, they're getting broken away from the child because they're not allowed near the child because of this allegation. Maybe a year, 2, 3, 4 years down the line, they're cleared of that allegation. By that time, the child has hardly seen or hasn't seen the parent and is alienated from them. And at the end of it, the person who made the false allegation, there's no consequences because the parent would have to take them up to court for slander or lying in court, and that's an expensive and very difficult to prove situation. Realistically, if there's a false allegation and it's proven that it's a malicious one, TUSLA or the Garda should intervene and turn it on to the alienating parent, but they don't.
Okay, so what changes would you like to see the government make legally or in policy to better protect children from this kind of manipulation?
To be for the best interest of the child and to fit in with the UN Convention of Rights for Children. What should happen around parental alienation is it should be defined. There's no definition of it. The government's done a whole pile of work on parental alienation, and then at the end of it, they decided not to define it. So they have created all this policy. They created a policy paper on something that they haven't defined. How can you act on something that's defined? How can you create guidelines or procedures or consequences for something that isn't defined? So definition, there should be consequences, whether financial or whether to do with access or custody, or whether it's that the alienating parent needs to go for therapy and for training on how to be a positive parent, because this is very negative on the child. This affects the child for their whole life. It affects their trust in relationships, their belief in relationships. And it's been proven through scientific papers on that the eradication of one parent in a child's life in a negative framework like in parental alienation affects the child, their future relationships, their situations on risk behaviors like addiction, and it can be lead to suicidization. Another thing I never mentioned about parents, there's been a number of alienated mothers and fathers who have taken that option over the years because this has been the final push against them. What I would say the government should do, there should be consequences for parental alienation. They should be defined. There should be support for parental alienation. There is no support in Ireland by TUSLA or any of the NGOs for alienated parents. Now, they'll say there is, but they're broad-based. They're not specific. It's a very unique form of abusive behavior that women's aid or men's aid haven't got the proper structures or support to address. And also that there should be early intervention. Once there is a conflict, a so-called conflict, it's usually one way about custody and access of a child, the judge should ask, why is this so? Why is it that previously, when they were in a relationship, that the child could live with the mother or live with the father, and there was no problem, and now all of a sudden there's allegations in there, and really it all comes down to bones that it should be 50-50 access automatic for when parents break up, but obviously dependent on their financial and behavioral situation, but that can be looked into, but it should be 50-50. Where's the equality in Ireland? If you're an unmarried father, you still haven't hardly any rights. You have to apply to court to be the father of a child. Isn't that ridiculous in this day and age?
So, Paul, if someone's listening right now and feels they're going through this, a parent being cut off from their child, what can they do, or where can they turn for help?
This is a problem out there. As I said, there's no statutory or NGO supports. There's minimal supports with Men's Aid and Men's Development Network. There's none with Women's Aid, because Women's Aid don't recognize parental alienation for their own financial and ideological reasons. And this is what we've found out there. There isn't on there. There's a number of support groups that are out there. I'm involved in a support group of over 100 parents and grandparents on WhatsApp. But I mean, it's got no support. Samaritans we have found is where the best support and advice for alienated parents are, especially if they're near the end of the road. But that's the last, that's the last measure,
Okay,
there are a number of therapists and counsellors out there who deal in parental alienation, and they're the experts. They're the ones at the coalface, and maybe they're the person that you should be interviewing. Really, not myself, because they know the reality of this problem.
Well, it's good to hear from you as an advocate as well, Paul. You're an advocate for these. It's very good to hear from you.
I'm an advocate, but they know they have the scientific and the skills and the training to be able, and experience to be able to give the real response. But the government haven't met with them. The government hasn't met with one victim of parental alienation since they've done research, they've done submissions, they've done a policy paper on parental alienation, a policy paper with 6 recommendations that are so broad that they don't help alienated parents. They miss the point that parental alienation is a very complex situation that needs expert differentiate between parental alienation, justified parental estrangement, which would be where a parent holds the child back from someone with an addiction or abusive behaviours, or false allegations. The judiciary, they don't even have the skills to differentiate if a child's voice is manipulated or if it's not. And in the recent government paper on the voice of the child, they specifically didn't put in the recommendations any safeguards to ensure that a child's genuine voice is heard, even though it was mentioned within the body of the paper. They didn't mention parental alienation and the specific measures that are needed. When a child is manipulated, their voice becomes the voice is manipulated by the parent, and they'll say what the custodial, the imprisoning parent wants them to say.
Okay.
They're scared to lose both parents.
I know.
A child is psychologically scared that if they say something against the alienated parent, they'll lose that parent too. Terrible for the child. It is.
Well, anyway, thank you so much for talking to us this morning, Paul, and we'll talk to you again. Thanks so much.
Lucinda Kelly was speaking there to Paul Anderson, an advocate for families affected by parental alienation. Now, I mentioned earlier I received quite a long text, a WhatsApp message concerning parental alienation. And I'm not going to read it out now because we have to make way for the news at 11 o'clock. But immediately after we come back for the news, I am going to turn to it. So thank you very much for the person who sent that information in. Also in the next hour, well, Science Week is currently up and running, and we're going to be speaking to Patrick Duggan about water and the importance of water. Yeah, I know. For the past few wet days we've had, there's water everywhere, you might think. We're also going to be speaking to Aideen Hassett of Brown Fire and Security and how she is expanding the business these days. And Bridgetown College, we're going to recognise them for their winning an award called the Digital Schools Award. And polio, you don't hear much of it in this country, but it is a problem around the rest of the world, and we're going to be hearing a little bit about it. A fundraiser for that, all coming up in the next hour.
Southeast Radio's Morning Mix.
Southeast Radio.
Thanks, Siobhan. And right now it's 6 minutes past 11. Before I turn to my next guest, who is joining us on the line, a couple of messages, as I said, that came in regarding the topic of parental alienation. This message from a grandmother. She says, I'm told you will discuss parental alienation. I am so grateful to you, as it seems to be a taboo subject. People don't want to believe that their parents are willing to use children as weapons and hurt their children in such a sinister way. It's very hard to prove, and it has lifelong damage to the children. I speak as a grandmother watching it going on, and the stress to my son as a father who has to be made little of by the courts and the mother of his children just to get a weekend here and there with them. Cruel beyond words to the children, telling them that the father that they love is bad and doesn't want them. Thank you again for bringing awareness to parental alienation. And I said there was another long text. I'm going to bring this to you because this person says that between 2019 and 2021, an overwhelming number of councils across Ireland passed motions calling on the government to formally recognise parental alienation as child welfare and child protection abuse. This movement has three goals: to align Ireland with the World Health Organisation's coding, to implement Recommendation 36 of the 2019 Oireachtas Justice Committee report on family law reform, and to ensure that TUSLA, the HSE and the courts are equipped to intervene early and effectively. We are now calling for alienating behaviours to be explicitly recognised in Irish law as both child abuse and coercive control. And then the message goes on to quote, for example, Denmark, who recently, in fact in January, brought in legislation to specifically address parental alienation as a form of psychological violence. Goes on to quote other countries, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, Israel, all treating it as a grave form of child abuse. And they say, it is time Ireland followed suit to protect every child's right to love and be loved by both parents, free from manipulation. And the systemic barrier is the in-camera rule. This texter says, I cannot speak on air or disclose my identity due to the in-camera rule in Irish family law. So while the rule's stated purpose is to protect privacy, its practical effect is a critical lack of transparency and public scrutiny. It can hide poor judicial decision-making and contributes to extremely lengthy and complex cases, often spanning years, sometimes a decade or more, and the legal costs incurred are catastrophic, often tens of thousands, and in complex disputes, hundreds of thousands. Our texter finishes by saying, crucially, the system is widely criticised for failing to provide adequate supports for families, leaving them to address the profound long-term damages often caused by the litigation process. And what saddens, and we heard Lucinda obviously talking earlier about this, what saddens me about this is many years ago on Southeast Radio, I covered the very same topic with others who are suffering through this. And since then, nothing has changed. It's a subject that the Morning Mix will come back to, I can promise you that. All right, now,